And welcome back again. Yours truly, Anthony Parker Alexander, of Keeping It Honest. We don't just keep it simple, we don't just keep it real, we keep it honest. On this show today, exactly at this time, 6:05, Thursday, April 4th, Dr. King was shot. So let's go back on this. When he was shot, it was 6:05, Thursday, April 4th. And if you're watching this now, it's also 6:05, Thursday, April 4th. The difference was when he got shot, it was 1968, but it was really on this day, 6:05, Thursday, April 4th, that 38-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King, unfortunately, was killed. And we're going to have a lot of interesting things we're going to be talking about on this show. We're going to talk about Dr. King's killing. We're going to talk about the drum major instinct. Um, I guess you would call it eulogy that he gave to himself. We're going to have the opinions of people who were there when he died. Uh, One of them is Dr. Um, Jesse Jackson, or Reverend Jesse Jackson. We're going to hear his take on it. And we're going to, unfortunately, relive through people's events and stories that I'm going to give you on what happened on that fateful day of April 4th, Thursday, 1968. And if some of you were alive, where were you at? And then also, what would have happened if King had have lived? Interesting. And could there have been a president or vice president, Dr. King? But this is how it started. And then we're going to talk about what happened the day before. But if you don't know anything about history, you're going to learn it today. And unfortunately, the real uncomfortable truth. So, as I say to you, let's sit back um, and let's really see, where were you at? Where were you at when Dr. King was assassinated? We are about to find out. Where were you at? How much of this did it change the course of history? Did it change it a lot? Did it not change it? Well, we know it had to change what we saw. Where were you at when Dr. King was killed? And is it making any difference now that he was killed? Are we better off? Are we not better off? Well, you know what? We're going to find out. Where were you at when King was killed?
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing two white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of his second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen. And police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes. Dr. King had this to say last night about the situation in Memphis.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
There was shock in Harlem tonight when word of Dr. King's murder reached the nation's largest Negro community. Men, women, and children poured into the streets. They appeared dazed. Many were crying. A young Negro said, Dr. King didn't really have to go back to Memphis. Maybe he wanted to prove something.
And maybe he wanted to prove something. If you remember, it was about the sanitation strike when Dr. King was assassinated. So he was fighting literally for people, which was interesting. And a lot of people don't know that he kind of changed by the time that he had passed away. Got killed. He had changed a little bit. He wasn't just for civil rights. He was for the civil rights of everybody. So, I tell people, look up what Dr. King was about. Wow. So now let's go back. Thursday, April 4th, 1968, at 6:05 p.m., King was struck in the face by a single bullet. And this was fired from a Remington model gun. He never regained consciousness, and he died at 7:05 p.m. So he was staying in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. The motel was owned by businessman Walter Bailey, and it was named after his wife. Reverend Abernathy, a colleague and friend, he later told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that he and King had stayed in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel so often that it was known as the King Abernathy Suite. So according to his biographer, one of them, Taylor Branch, King's last words were to musician Ben Branch, who was scheduled to perform that night at a planned event. So King said, Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty. So according to Reverend Samuel Cowles, who we're going to have talking about that night and that day with King, who was standing several feet away, King was leaning over the balcony railing in front of room 306 and was speaking with Reverend Jackson when the shot rang out. King was struck in the face by a single bullet. So it's a little bit graphic, but we have to notice. The bullet entered through King's right cheek, breaking his jaw and several vertebrae as it traveled down his spinal cord, severing his jugular vein and major arteries in the process, before lodging in his shoulder. The force of the shot ripped King's necktie off. King fell backward onto the balcony, unconscious. So Abernathy, he heard the shot from inside the motel room, and he ran to the balcony to find King on the deck, bleeding from the wound in his cheek. Wow. Jesse Jackson stated after the shooting that he cradled King's head as King lay on the balcony, but this account was disputed by other colleagues of King. And I remember they said that Jackson said he was cradling him and blood was on his own shoulder. Jackson later changed his mind to say that he had reached out for King. Andrew Young, a colleague, first believed King was dead, but found that he still had a pulse. So King was then rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors opened his chest and they performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation. He never regained consciousness and he died at 7:05 p.m. According to Branch King's autopsy revealed, now listen to this, that his heart was in the condition of a 60-year-old man rather than a 39-year-old man because it was attributed to the stress of his 13 years, wow, in the civil rights movement. Man, so you think about that. Dr. King was going through so many things. Man, fighting for civil rights, doing everything he needed to do, that he seemed to be older than really what he was. Wow. So you just saw Walter Cronkite, who was on the evening news way back then. So he gave the news of him dying. And how did it affect a lot of people? You know, were they affected where they didn't know what to do? You think about this. Here's a guy who got shot and he got killed. And where were you at? Or where were your parents at when they heard it? This is what happened across the world.
Martin Luther King 20 minutes ago died.
Look at the
I would
crowd.
like to take this opportunity to ask Reverend John Genzel, who is the jazz minister, to lead all of us in prayer for Martin Luther King and the future of all civil rights movements. Would you please rise?
Some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence. I pray that his family can find comfort in the memory of all he tried to do for the land he loved so well.
So where were you at when you saw that? Or where were your parents at when they saw that? The brutal killing of a legend. And when he got shot, was at the end of the dream? It was very interesting because shortly after the shot was fired, witnesses saw a man who later they believed was James O'Ray fleeing from a rooming house across the street from the motel where Dr. King was killed. Police found a package dumped close to the site that included a rifle and binoculars, both with Ray's fingerprints on there. So this worldwide manhunt was started, and Ray was arrested finally 2 months later on March 10th, 1969. He pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Dr. King, but he later recanted it. People didn't really believe him. So this is interesting because, like I said, Dr. King died. And did the world mourn? Yes, they did. We're going to talk about, again, we're going to have clips from Dr. King's kids. We're going to have clips from Jesse Jackson. We're going to talk about this speech, okay? This drum speech, which I thought was really, really interesting. This drum major instinct speech. So after Dr. King died, on the night of his funeral, he said if he ever gets killed, he wants this speech played, he wants this song played. And that's what he got. He got this speech and he got this song to be played at his funeral. But it was interesting. The speech is called the Drum Major Instinct. A lot of people have heard different speeches by King, but you listen to the speech. It's one of the best speeches that he has ever given. He gave this speech 2 months to the day that he died. And he said, you know what? If I ever die, I want portions of the speech played at my funeral. So they did the funeral and everything, but they also did this speech, and it's called the Drum Major Speech. I want you to listen to this. We're going to talk about it as it's playing, because it's I'm telling you, you have to hear it because it's an amazing speech. It is called the Drum Major Instinct Speech. When we're full of ourselves, sometimes we have to realize that we can't be better than anybody else, because there's that karma and it will come back. Dr. King said he was a simple man. And here is parts of the Drum Major Instinct Speech.
The setting is clear. James and John are making a specific request of the Master. They had dreamed, as most of the Hebrews dreamed, of a coming king of Israel who would set Jerusalem free and establish his kingdom on Mount Zion, and in righteousness rule the world. And they thought of Jesus as this kind of king, and they were thinking of that day when Jesus would reign supreme as this new king of Israel. And they were saying, now, when you establish your kingdom, let one of us sit on the right hand and the other on the left hand of your throne. Now, very quickly, we would automatically condemn James and John, and we would say they were selfish. Why would they make such a selfish request? But before we condemn them too quickly, let us look calmly and honestly at ourselves, and we will discover that we too have those same basic desires for recognition, for importance, that same desire for attention, that same desire to be first. Of course, the other disciples got mad with James and John, and you can understand why, but we must understand that we have some of the same James and John qualities. And that is deep down within all of us an instinct. It's a kind of drum major instinct, a desire to be out front, a desire to lead the parade, a desire to be first. It is something that runs the whole gamut of life. And so before we condemn them, let us see that we all have the drum major instinct. We all want to be important, to surpass others, to achieve distinction, to lead the parade. Alfred Adler, the great psychoanalyst, contends that this is the dominant impulse. Sigmund Freud used to contend that sex was the dominant impulse, and Adler came with a new argument saying that this quest for recognition, this desire for attention, this desire for distinction is the basic impulse, the basic drive of human life, this drum major instinct. And you know, we began early to ask life to put us first. Our first cry as a baby was a bid for attention. And all through childhood, the drum major impulse or instinct is a major obsession. Children ask life to grant them first place. They are a little bundle of ego. They have innately the drum major impulse or the drum major instinct. Now, in adult life, we still have it, and we really never get by it. We like to do something good, and you know, we like to be praised for it. Now, if you don't believe that, you just go on living life, and you will discover very soon that you like to be praised. Everybody likes it, as a matter of fact. And somehow this warm glow we feel when we are praised or when our name is in print is something of the vitamin A to our ego. Nobody is unhappy when they are praised, even if they know they don't deserve it, and even if they don't believe it. The only unhappy people about praise is when that praise is going too much towards somebody else. But everybody likes to be praised because of this real drum major instinct.
And this is interesting, this drum major instinct. Some people have heard about it, some people haven't, but it is one of his greatest speeches ever. And you can go back and listen to it in total, which is good, because you will never, ever forget it. So this drum major instinct, his sermon, in it, he acknowledges the fact that many people desire recognition. A lot of people want to be famous. They want to be known. That's what everybody's life's about. The desire to be the first. You want to be the first in everything. Sometimes you can't be the first. So he calls this desire the drum major instinct, to be the first. But he proposes an alternative kind of ambition that one can achieve through a life of service. I just want to leave a committed life behind. Rather, as a prophet, which he was, and this is interesting, but what is a prophet? He discusses in this conclusion what he would like to be said about him at his own funeral. He did this 2 months to the day that he got shot and killed. This is the drum major instinct.
But very seriously, it goes through life. The drum major instinct is real. And you know what else had happened or causes happen to happen? It often causes us to live above our means. It's nothing but the drum major instinct. You ever see people buy cars that they can't even begin to buy in terms of their income? You've seen people riding around in Cadillacs and Chrysler who don't earn enough to have a good T Model Ford. But it feeds a repressed ego. You know, economists tell us that your automobile should not cost more than half of your annual income. So if you make an income of $5,000, your car shouldn't cost more than about $2,500. That's just good economics. And if it's a family of two and both members of the family make $10,000, they would have to make out with one car. That would be good economics, although it's often inconvenient. But so often, haven't you seen people making $5,000 a year and driving a car that costs $6,000, and they wonder why their ends never meet? That's a fact. Now, the economists also say that your house shouldn't cost, if you're buying a house, it shouldn't cost more than twice your income. That's based on the economy and how you would make ends meet. So if you have an income of $5,000, it's kind of difficult in this society, but say it's a family with an income of $10,000, the house shouldn't cost much more than $20,000. Well, I've seen folks making $10,000 living in $40,000 and $50,000 house. And you know, they just barely make it. They get a check every month somewhere, and they owe all of that out before it comes in. Never have anything to put away for rainy days. But now the problem is, it is the drum major instinct. And you know, you see people over and over again with the drum major instinct taking them over, and they just live their lives trying to outdo the Jones. They got to get this coat because this particular coat is a little better and a little better looking than Mary's coat. I got to drive this car because it's something about this car that makes my car a little better than my neighbor's car. I know a man who used to live in a $35,000 house, and other people started building $35,000 houses, so he built a $75,000 house, and then somebody else built a $75,000 house, and he built a $100,000 house, and I don't know where he's going to end up if he's going to live his life trying to keep up with the Joneses.
And it's funny because he talked about keeping up with the Joneses back then. How many people are still trying to keep up with the Joneses? As society and culture change, everybody is still about it being about me. At the end of the day, what is important to you? Is it friends? Is it family? Above all, is it you? Can you make it without having to have that money to be in society? Back then, Dr. King said everybody has a drum major instinct. Today, on this day, do we still have a drum major instinct? So, we're talking about Dr. King, assassination that day, and how the world changed. So after he died, President Johnson, he called for a national day of mourning to be observed on April 7th. And the following days, libraries, museums, schools, and businesses were closed, and the Academy Awards ceremony was canceled. On April 8th, King's widow, Coretta Scott King, and other family members joined thousands of participants in a march in Memphis, banning King and honoring King. Well, even back then, people still were banning him and honoring King, and joined hundreds of thousands of people across the country. So the funeral service was held following day at Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was attended by many, of the nation's leaders. Jacqueline Kennedy, Vice President Herbert Humphrey, Morehouse College professor Benjamin Mays, he delivered the eulogy, and he predicted that King would probably say that if death had to come, I am sure there was no greater cause to die for than fighting to get a just wage for garbage collectors. So over 100,000 mourners followed two mules pulling King's coffin through the streets of Atlanta. And after another ceremony on the Morehouse campus, King's body was initially rested at Southview Cemetery. Eventually, it was moved to a crypt next to the Ebenezer Church at the King Center, an institution founded by King's widow. Wow. So we know about the conspiracies and everything. We're not going to go into that pretty much. We may talk a little bit about it, but here was a guy that was doing his own thing. And we're going to talk about that when he died. Was he loved by a lot of people? Was King trying to redo things in his life? Maybe, do some things a little bit different when he died. But he did die doing what he did.
There comes a time that the drum major instinct can become destructive. And that's where I want to move now. I want to move to the point of saying that if this instinct is not harnessed, it becomes a very dangerous, pernicious instinct. For instance, if it isn't harnessed, it causes one's personality to become distorted. I guess that's the most damaging aspect of it, what it does to the personality.
And you can think about some of the celebrities, entertainers, politicians who at one point they were honest, trying to do the right thing. But then because of society and power corrupts absolute power, it got to their head. And the drum major instinct turned them from a really good person into a very bad person. The tragedy, as Dr. King said, of the drum major instinct.
If it isn't harnessed, you will end up day in and day out trying to deal with your ego problem by boasting. Have you ever heard people that, you know, and I'm sure you've met them, that really become sickening because they just sit up all the time talking about themselves. And they just boast and boast and boast. And that's a person who has not harnessed the drum major instinct. And then it does other things to the personality. It causes you to lie about who you know sometimes. There are some people who are influence peddlers. And in that attempt to deal with the drum major instinct, they have to try to identify with the so-called big name people. And if you're not careful, they will make you think they know somebody that they don't really know. They know them well. They sip tea with them, and they this and that. That happens to people. And the other thing is that it causes one to engage ultimately in activities that are merely used to get attention. Criminologists tell us that some people are driven to crime because of this drum major instinct. They don't feel that they're getting enough attention through the normal channels of social behavior. And so they turn to antisocial behavior in order to get attention, in order to feel important. And so they get that gun, and before they know it, they rob the bank in a quest for recognition, in a quest for importance. And then the final great tragedy of the distorted personality is the fact that when one fails to harness this instinct, he ends up trying to push others down in order to push himself up. And whenever you do that, you engage in some of the most vicious activities. You will spread evil, vicious, lying gossip on people because you're trying to pull them down in order to push yourself up. The great issue of life is to harness the drum major instinct. Now, the other problem is when you don't harness the drum major instinct, this uncontrolled aspect of it is that it leads to snobbish exclusivism. It leads to snobbish exclusivism. Now, you know, this is the danger of social clubs and fraternities. I'm in a fraternity. I'm in 2 or 3. For sororities and all of these. I'm not talking against them. I'm saying it's the danger. The danger is that they can become forces of classism and exclusivism, where somehow you get a degree of satisfaction because you are in something exclusive, and that's fulfilling something, you know. And I'm in this fraternity, and it's the best fraternity in the world, and everybody can't get in this fraternity. So it ends up, you know, a very exclusive kind of thing. And you know, that can happen with the church. I know churches get in that bind sometimes.
And he's right. This part I'm going to love because he's going to be talking about churches. And, some people feel that churches aren't there for us. Are they? To me, if you're a Christian, you believe in God, you believe in being a moralistic person, giving money, tithing, that doesn't just make you a moralistic person. It makes you a person that gives them, money. My thing has been, but if the common person comes and asks you for help, are you more or less gonna reciprocate and help them out face to face? Is that more uncomfortable? Or are you gonna tithe to the church? To me, you can still tithe, but then you can also give to people that need some help. So, speaking of help, you're watching Keeping It Honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker. We don't just keep it simple. We don't just keep it real. We keep it honest. Telephone number. You can text me, call me, 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. Let me know what you think about this. Dr. King and the Drum Major Instinct Show. He died on this day, April 4th, Thursday, 1968. What day is it? Thursday, April 4th, 2024. How much of time has passed in those 56 years where this day and this year seems like it could still be April 4th, 1968. Wow, it just makes you think. We try to do things, like I said, with Parker Twist, try to give the left side, we try to get the right side. We try to hopefully let you decide that, sometimes things are uncomfortable. And we talk about sometimes uncomfortable subjects. We're talking about the Drum Major Instinct and Dr. King's legacy, because boy, does he have a legacy. Some of the people, it's bad when some of the people who were around with him aren't around as much now. One guy who recently retired, that was one of his best buddies, and he reflects on his legacy and friendship, is Reverend Jesse Jackson.
We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
The day he came in, where you see Hosea, Dr. King, Abernathy now in the balcony, that's when he came in. And we left there and went and met with some ministers about what could they do. One, not fear the mark could be disrupted again, and take our eyes off the plight of organizing the garbage workers, and how you mobilize your congregations to see the value in now we're free raising wages for working people and the health benefits to go with that. We talked in that meeting about the possibility of a boycott, that if Loeb will not hear what we have to say, then take Coca-Cola, he mentions in that speech, and Wonder Bread, we could take some big corporations that we have high consumer strength with and boycott them, if need be, till they use their strength, say to the mayor that this is important, what I call redistribute the pain, so more people are hurting than just the garbage workers. We left there and came back to the hotel that afternoon, and he was very relaxed. Then he said, I really don't feel like speaking tonight. And so asked me would I go and speak, and to say ask him when he go and speak. And I said, I just don't have, I'm kind of empty, so to speak. If Dr. Abernathy will go, he said, wherever you go with him. So Reverend Cowles was there. Ben Hooks had been there. Mm-hmm. And we then, around 6, went over to Mason Temple. And when we walked in the door and the people cheering, so Rab said, they're cheering, not because they see us, because they think Martin is behind us. It's not us they're cheering for, we laughed about it. And so we say he has to come. He got there, and Ralph gave a rather long introduction, in part kind of buy some time because I say he didn't feel like speaking. It's a picture I got from you guys of my talking about the King. I was trying to brief him on what was happening, kind of what had happened, and the mood as we saw it. And he got it without a single note and went back through the page of history. This would be the great time to be alive. He was kind of going back to the history reflection stuff, as much what he had done earlier that day. But that day was about personal history reflection. He was kind of the philosophical, historical journey to who we are tonight. We could not have known how severe the threats were and how imminent death was. He may have known because he felt the pressures. That was a kind of transition speech. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. And I've seen the promised land. What I thought was so different about that sermon, the reaction was, I saw men crying. You know, usually men as such don't cry in church except in very situations. It was just like with something pathos about that moment, that time, that presentation. We didn't know it would be the final one. And then the next day, we had another relaxed day, right, in the room. Mm-hmm. And what I remember next was coming across the courtyard about 6, and Reverend Cowles came out the door first. Dr. King was behind him. And just said, we're going to Reverend Cowles' home for dinner. You don't even have on a tie. I said, Doc, the prerequisite for eating is an appetite, not a tie. He said, you're crazy. We laughed about that. Then he said to Billy, must have been 10 feet from him at that time, because you had just left out the door. And he looked at him and saw Ben. The reason Ben was, he had heard Ben at the breadbasket meeting play the song Precious Lord on the saxophone about 3 weeks before. We used to play my favorite song tonight. And Ben said, I will, Doc. And he's raised me. I said, Doc. That's when it hit. And no one could see the impact of it, really. I could see it, Reverend Cowles could see it, because Reverend Cowles was like about far as where you are from him. And it hit him and knocked him against the door. I heard someone saying, get low, get low. I remember running toward the steps. And that is this picture of Reverend Cowles and then some guy, I think, from the Department of Justice, I think, pointing. Remember that picture? Well, the story behind that is we were saying the bullet had to come from that way. It couldn't have come from that. So take your guns and go to where the shot came from. That's what that picture is about. I got up then and went to the room next door and called Mrs. King. That was a long 10 steps. I had the phone by the bed and said to her, Mrs. King, just got things. I said, well, doctor got shot, I think, in the shoulder. I really couldn't say what I saw. I think in the shoulder. I'm sure in about 7 to 8 minutes she knew, because the wire service picked up real fast. As Reverend Cowles says so profoundly, he was the witness. He was 10 feet from him when it took place. He was in the room. He proceeded Dr. King out of the room, so he was a witness, and we all were to that extent.
So you're hearing about that Reverend Jesse Jackson, who had decades of civil rights. He recently resigned from PUSH. But the legacy of Dr. King, wow. That might have been, really what could have been. What could have Dr. King have continued to do? You're watching Keeping It Honest. Yours truly, Anthony Parker, the drum major instinct today. And the legacy, we always say legacy of people. And there is a legacy, as we know, with Dr. King, and prayerfully, everybody out there that's doing something with their life, make sure you have a legacy, that you're just not living day by day. You may not be able to do what King did, but just able to be you and show humanity and compassion to people. That is truly what counts. questions or comments, you can email me, parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. And we were talking about the drum major instinct, and Dr. King is talking about even churches can get ahead of themselves.
I've been to churches, and they say, we have so many doctors and so many school teachers and so many lawyers and so many businessmen in our church. And that's fine, because doctors need to go to church, and lawyers and businessmen, teachers, they ought to be in church. But they say that, even the preacher sometimes will go all through that. They say that as if the other people don't count. The church is the one place where the doctor ought to forget that he's a doctor. The church is the one place where the PhD ought to forget that he's a PhD. The church is the one place that the school teacher ought to forget the degree she has behind her name. The church is the one place where the lawyer ought to forget that he's a lawyer. And any church that violates the whosoever will let him come doctrine is a dead church, and nothing but a little culture with a thin of religiosity. The church is true to its so it will let him come. Not whosoever will let him come. It does not supposed to satisfy the perverted uses of the drum major instinct. It's the one place where everybody should be the same, standing before a common master and savior. And a recognition grows out of this that all men are brothers because they are children of a common father. From the instinct lead to exclusivist one instinct.
Wow. Parts of that was kind of jarbled at the end, but he was talking about Dr. King, about the churches, and he's in some ways a prophet, because he talked about churches then, and to some people, churches are still like that today. But society as a whole, it just puts pressure on all of us. We're supposed to be the best that we can be, but not better than anybody else. And that's the one thing that we really have to think about. This drum major instinct is as strong as today as it was back then.
Lead one feel, can lead one to feel that because he has some training, he's a little better than that person who doesn't have it. Or because he has some economic security, that he's a little better than that person who doesn't have it. And that's the uncontrolled, perverted use of the drum major instinct. Now, the other thing is that it leads to tragic, and we've seen it happen so often, tragic race prejudice.
This recording is briefly interrupted at this point.
We see with our own eyes. In fact, not too long ago, a man down in Mississippi said that God was a charter member of the White Citizens Council. And so, God being the charter member means that everybody who's in that has a kind of divinity, a kind of superiority. And think of what has happened in history as a result of this perverted use of the drum major instinct. It's led to the most tragic prejudice, the most tragic expressions of man's inhumanity to man.
When are we going to learn to love each other? If Dr. King was alive today, would he be disappointed or not? I mean, we had a African-American, a black president. We have a black vice president. We have a lot of people in power. From what I read at the time and seen at the time Dr. King got assassinated, like I said, he seemed to change. He was more reflective on society, and he was kind of disappointed how the the country was turning. Why can't blacks and whites get along? Because no matter what, if it goes down to money, then we all want some money. We all want to try to make it and fight for equality and racism. As far as, you know what, you're black, I'm white, you're another nationality, we're kind of not making it. Let's get together and try to make it.
The other day I was saying I always try to do a little converting when I'm in jail. And when we were in jail in Birmingham the other day, the white wardens and all enjoyed coming around the cell to talk about the race problem. And they were showing us where we were so wrong demonstrating. And they were showing us where segregation was so right. And they were showing us where intermarriage was so wrong. So I would get to preaching and we would get to talking calmly because they wanted to talk about it. And then we got down one day to the point, that was the second or third day, to talk about where they lived and how much they were earning. And when those brothers told me what they were earning, I said, now, you know what? You ought to be marching with us. You just as poor as Negro. And I said, you are put in the position of supporting your oppressor because through prejudice and blindness, you fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in American society oppress poor white people. And all you are living on is the satisfaction of your skin being white and the drum major instinct of thinking that you are somebody big because you're white and you're so poor you can't send your children to school. You ought to be out here marching with every one of us every time we have a march. Now that's a fact. The poor white has been put into this position where through blindness and prejudice he is forced to support his oppressors. And the only thing he has going for him is the false feeling that he's superior because his skin is white and can't hardly eat and make his ends meet week in and week out. Now, not only does it stop, not only does this thing go into the racial struggle, it goes into the struggle between nations. And I would submit to you this morning that what is wrong in the world today is that the nations of the world are engaged in a bitter, colossal contest for supremacy. And if something doesn't happen to stop this trend, I'm sorely afraid that we won't be here to talk about Jesus Christ and about God and about brotherhood too many more years. If somebody doesn't bring an end to this suicidal thrust that we see in the world today, none of us are going to be around because somebody is going to make the mistake through our senseless blunderings of dropping a nuclear bomb somewhere and then another one is going to drop. And don't let anybody fool you. This can happen within a matter of seconds.
It could happen in a matter of seconds, even today, 56 years later. Back then he was talking about peace. We've got Russia, we've got China, we've got all these other different countries, depending who the political politicians are in office. And I never understood this till about a couple years ago when they say pray for the politicians. Make sure that they're of their right mind, because if you don't pray for the politicians, then the wrong ones will get in office, whoever you believe is that politician. And they could start a war. Something to think about. Wow. You're watching Keeping It Honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker. And we are talking about Dr. King. He was assassinated on this day. We should not ever forget that. And as I'm talking about not forgetting certain things, let's go back to some of the hard truths of what happened on that day and afterwards. Let's see if there's some things that we should remember, because like history, if we don't remember it, we tend to forget it and it comes back. These are some of the pictures. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Spoken by Dr. King the night before his assassination. So he probably knew he was going through tough times.
King Jr. had just returned to Memphis. For over a year, as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he had been planning the Poor People's Campaign, an attempted expansion of the civil rights movement that would include economic and human rights for poor Americans of diverse backgrounds. In Memphis, that struggle was on display. King planned to march with 1,300 mostly black sanitation workers who had gone on strike in February seeking union recognition, dues checkoff, and an increase to their $1.65 to $2.10 an hour wage. Working conditions were hideous. The walkout had been precipitated by the deaths of 2 workers who had been crushed to death inside their own garbage truck.
Turn any blog, script, or article into a professional video in minutes.
So you look at that, and for some of the older people, do we forget where we were?
Mason Temple on April 3rd. He sought to rally his supporters for a peaceful march, then scheduled for April 9th. He warned against the violence that had marred a previous protest, lest violence overshadow the justice of the union's cause. Nearing the close of his address, he recurred to his vision of the promised land and of the peace that vision had brought him. This was not the first time King had prophesied his own death.
So you see Dr. King over there, and fighting for everybody. He's giving a speech, and look at the people back then in the 1960s. Let's not forget these images, okay? There were a lot of things, different cultures they couldn't do. And they fought for the right to vote, to have the right. Dr. King fought. Where would we be at? This is the images. Dr. King is at the Lorraine Motel. This is right before Dr. King gets killed. There's Jesse Jackson, there's Reverend Abernathy. And they were up there looking around because they were preparing to do a speech. And the night before, Dr. King, like I said, he was kind of nervous. Some people say he knew that he was going to get killed for his speeches. But he still did what he needed to do. And in hindsight, you pray it was worth it, because what if Dr. King had not had to go that day? What if he didn't go at all? What if the shooter had missed him? Wow, where would this world be at today? Man, something to think about as you are watching Keeping It Honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker, as we talk about and we go back to the Drum Major Instinct speech or sermon, where he talks about things that, It could be uncomfortable to a lot of people, but as Dr. King has proven, nothing, I guess, is too uncomfortable or was too uncomfortable for Dr. King. So we're talking about nations and how nations back then and nations today, they need to get along, or we will have another war coming up.
They have 20 megaton bombs in Russia right now that can destroy a city as big as New York in 3 seconds with everybody wiped away in every building. And we can do the same thing to Russia and China. But this is where we have drifted, and we're drifting there because nations are caught up with the drum major instinct. I must be first. I must be supreme. Our nation must rule the world. And I am sad to say that the nation in which we live is the supreme culprit. And I'm going to continue to say it to America, because I love this country too much to see the drift that it has taken. God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war as the war in Vietnam. And we are
The future is not just going to happen. You have to make it.
And this is about to get really good, too.
more war crimes almost than any nation in the world, and I'm going to continue to say it. And we won't stop it because of our pride and our arrogance as a nation. But God has a way of even putting nations in their place. The God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. He has a way of saying, as the God of the Old Testament used to say, the Hebrews, don't play with me, Israel. Don't play with me, Babylon. Be still and know that I'm God. If you don't stop your reckless course, I'll rise up and break the backbone of your power. And that can happen to America. Every now and then I go back and read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And when I come and look at America, I say to myself, the parallels are frightening. We have perverted the drum major instinct. But let me rush on to my conclusion because I want you to see what Jesus was really saying.
So right on with this, because this is about to get even better.
What was the answer that Jesus gave these men? It's very interesting. One would have thought that Jesus would have condemned them. One would have thought that Jesus would have said, you are out of your place. You're selfish. Why would you raise such a question? That isn't what Jesus did. He did something altogether different. He said in substance, oh, I see. You want to be first? You want to be great? You want to be important? You want to be significant? Well, you ought to be. If you're going to be my disciple, you must be. But he reordered priorities. And he said, yes, don't give up this instinct. It's a good instinct if you use it right. It's a good instinct if you don't distort it and pervert it. Don't give it up. Keep feeling the need for being important. Keep feeling the need for being first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity. That is what I want you to do. And he transformed the situation by giving a new definition of greatness. And you know how he said it? He said, now, brethren, I can't give you greatness. And really, I can't make you first. This is what Jesus said to James and John. You must earn it. True greatness comes not by favoritism, but by fitness. And the right hand and the left are not mine to give. They belong to those who are prepared. And so Jesus gave us a new norm of greatness. If you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. That's a new definition of greatness. And this morning, the thing that I like about it, by giving that definition of greatness, it means that everybody can be great. Because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics in physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace. Soul generated by love.
There you go. What do you need to serve? He just told you. Speaking of serving, just think about that person. Who was that person? Somebody who should be a great role model to you because he served. Who was Jesus?
You can be that servant. I know a man, and I just want to talk about him a minute, and maybe you will discover who I'm talking about as I go down the way. Because he was a great one. He just went about serving. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a poor peasant woman. And then he grew up in still another obscure village where he worked as a carpenter until he was 30 years old. Then for 3 years, he just got on his feet and he was an itinerant preacher. And he went about doing some things. He didn't have much. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family. He never owned a house. He never went to college. He never visited a big city. He never went 200 miles from where he was born. He did none of the usual things that the world would associate with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was on it when the tide of public opinion turned against him. They called a rout. They turned against him. They called him a rabble-rouser. They called him a troublemaker. They said he was an agitator. He practiced civil disobedience. He broke injunctions. And so he was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. And the irony of it all is that his friends turned him over to them. One of his closest friends denied him. Another of his friends turned him over to his enemies. And while he was dying, the people who killed him gambled for his clothing, the only possession that he had in the world. When he was dead, he was buried in a borrowed tomb through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone. Today, he He stands as the most influential figure that ever entered human history. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all parts that ever stood, all kings that ever reigned together, not fit the life of men put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. His name may be a familiar one, but today I can hear him talking about him. Every now and then somebody says he's King of Kings. Again, I can hear somebody saying he's Lord of Lords. Somewhere else I can hear somebody saying, in Christ there is no east nor west. And then they go on and talk about in him there's no north and south, but one great fellowship of love throughout the whole wide world. He didn't have anything. He just went around serving and doing good. This morning, you can be on his right hand and his left hand if you serve. It's the only.
Wow. You talk about the ultimate person that served, Jesus Christ. This is the Drum Major Instinct sermon. This was given February 4th, 1968, 2 months to the day of Dr. King's assassination. Wow. That's crazy. You're watching Keeping It Honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker. April 4th, 1968. A day that really changed history for African Americans, for the world. What is the legacy of Dr. King? Well, you know what? He had 4 kids. And you talk about legacy. So out of the 4 kids, 2 are alive now. Yolanda King passed away at 2007. Dexter King passed away 2024. The ones that are still alive, carrying on his legacy, is Bernice King and Martin Luther King III. And this is one of the few times that all 4 of them were together to talk about his legacy.
King's 3 surviving children haven't spoken together about their father's legacy in a dozen years, but they did with Michelle Miller, an interview you'll see only here on CBS. Martin Luther King III was 10 when his father died. Dexter was 7 and Bernice 5.
It's hard to forget the images, and sometimes I have to catch myself because I get emotional. Martin and I were watching television, and even to this day, when I see a breaking news flash, I have PTSD. And so even though it's been 50 years, it doesn't seem like it. For me, it seems like it was yesterday.
Bernice, what do you remember?
What I do vividly remember is the day of the funeral. So I'm sitting right on the corner here at Ebenezer. I'm in my mother's lap. And so Mom said he couldn't speak to me, but a child kind of knows the dad's voice.
Every now and then I think about my own death and I think about my own funeral.
And if you look at the film, I'm looking around like, where is he? So I remember that to this day in this sanctuary.
This was to be a peaceful march to City Hall.
68 was a time when your father's popularity was waning.
Mom used to say something like, because his voice is silenced, now he's loved.
What does that mean?
We sort of dumbed down Dad to some degree. He was a doer, not just a dreamer. He talked about what could become, but he left us a blueprint for how that could be manifested.
Leading the march, the Reverend Martin Luther King.
Dad was really radical and revolutionary, and America doesn't understand that yet.
I have to ask this question of you. Did you have to lose your father for the nation and the world to appreciate him the way they do today?
You look at the greater good in terms of the sacrifice, because if he had lived, he may not have been, I'm certain he would not have been as effective. Because he gave his life, he was martyred, and then you remember all of the positive things he left behind.
So was he a martyr? Did he have to die for, I guess, the world to become a better place? In some people's eyes, people say it's not a better place, but in other people's eyes, it is. Let's keep it honest. You have your pros and your cons. And if Dr. King had never been around, think about the tragedy, how that would have been. Wow. So, how did Dr. King want to be remembered? Did he want to be remembered as a good guy? Did he want to be remembered as a bad guy? Did he want to be remembered as, I'm a guy that just tried to do the right thing? Well, I think you know how he wanted to be remembered.
On the way in, every now and then I guess all think realistic about that day when we will be victimized with what is life's final common denominator. That's something we call death. We all think about it, and every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral, and I don't think of it in a morbid sense. Every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? And I leave the word to you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too much. Every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word of song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian, or if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain. Yes, Jesus, I want to be on your right or your left side, not for any selfish reason. I want to be on your right or your left side, not in terms of some political kingdom or ambition, but I just want to be there in love and in justice and in truth and in commitment to others so that we can make of this old world a new world.
And there you have it. Man, the drum major instinct sermon. with Dr. King. What would have been if he would still be around today? Wow. Hopefully you got something out of that Drum Major Instinct speech, or I'm sorry about speech, sermon. If you want to get it again in its entirety without any interruptions, look it up, Drum Major Instinct. Is that different from 58 years ago with Dr. King, or 56 years ago with Dr. King on Thursday? This day, April 4th, 38-year-old Dr. King was assassinated. What would have been if he had continued? You're keeping it honest, where we've been talking about this today. And so you wonder, here's something you probably don't know. What would happen if Dr. King would have still lived? So I'm going to read you this. So if he had not been killed, it's certain that he would have remained a powerful force. You pray he would have in society. It's interesting, in 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a winner. And it was economic inequality that was one of his last things in his life. He was still a civil rights leader. He would have fought continuously for people. When he turned and started talking political regarding the Vietnam War, that's when people started not liking him. So one of the things he continued or wanted to do was a poor people's campaign. He planned for an initial group of impoverished Americans of all races to descend and do like a march in Washington in May 68 to lobby for minimum wages, jobs, unemployment. So before he decided to do that, of course, he unfortunately died. I thought this was really interesting. He would have continued to speak out about the Vietnam War. He would have taken hits about that. And the racial relations, there were a lot of Black people, African Americans, who didn't like what he was standing for. So in 1967, before his death, see this right here? Okay. Right there. Dr. King, running for political office. They tried to get him to do a third party, kind of like a Cornel West, but he decided against a political office try. Wow. What if he would have ran for president? What would have happened after that? Because of course, Jesse Jackson ran for president. Andrew Young, who was one of his friends, he ran for president. So, ironically, he had a federal holiday. But think about this. In the 5 years leading up to his death, how popular was he? King appeared on the top 10 of Gallup's most admired list only twice. In 10 years, he did it only twice, in 64 and 65. And in 1967, the racist George Wallace ranked 8th, while King could not crack the number 10. But by 1999, found out that King ranked only behind Mother Teresa as the century's most admired person. Wow. Until this day, he's still at the top of that list. So you've been watching Dr. King and the Drum Major Instinct. Questions, comments, email me, parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. You can text me, 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. We kept it honest. We can still make a change. We were making it over 50 years ago. We can still make it today. Remember, every change doesn't have to start with everyone. It just starts with one. I'm Anthony Parker. Keep your head up, never look down, always believe in yourself, and therein will lie your answer. Keep it simple, keep it real, and keep it honest. I'm Anthony Parker Alexander. God bless.